Farmer Boy, Chapter 19. Early Harvest. Now it was haying time, and Father brought out the scythe, and Almanzo turned the grindstone with one hand and poured a little stream of water on it with the other hand. A scythe is a big knife that they use to cut down the grain with. Just so you know that, otherwise this doesn't make sense. Father held the steel edges delicately against the whirring stone. The water kept the scythe from getting too hot, while the stone ground the edges thin and sharp. Then Almanzo went through the woods to the little French cabins and told French Joe and Lazy John to come to work the next morning. As the sun dried the dew on the meadows, Father and Joe and John began cutting the hay. They walked side by side, swinging their scythes in the tall grass, and the plumed timothy fell in great swaths. Swish, swish, swish went the scythes, while Almanzo and Pierre and Louis followed behind them, spreading out the heavy swaths with pitchforks so that they could dry evenly in the sunshine. The stubble was cool and soft under their bare feet. Birds flew up before the mowers, and now and then a rabbit jumped and bounded away. High and up in the air meadowlarks sang. The sun grew hotter. The smell of hay grew stronger and sweeter. Then waves of heat began to come up from the ground. Almanzo's brown arms burned browner, and the sweat trickled on his forehead. The men stopped to put green leaves in the crowns of their hats. So did the boys. For a little while the leaves were cool on top of their heads. In the middle of the morning, Mother blew the dinner horn, and Almanzo knew what that meant. He stuck its pitchfork in the ground and went running and skipping down and across the meadows to the house. Mother met him in the back porch with the milk pail brimming full of cold eggnog. The eggnog was made of milk and cream with plenty of eggs and sugar. Its foamy top was freckled with spices, and pieces of ice floated in it. The sides of the pail were misty with cold. Almanzo trudged slowly toward the hayfield with the heavy pail and the dipper. He thought to himself that the pail was too full. He might just spill some of the eggnog. Mother said waste was sinful. He was sure it would be sinful to waste a drop of that eggnog. He should do something to save it. So he set down the pail and he dipped some of the dipper full and he drank. The cold eggnog slid smoothly down his throat, and it made him cool inside. When he reached the hayfield, everyone stopped work. They stood in the shade of the oak and pushed back their hats and passed the dipper from hand to hand till all the eggnog was gone. Almanzo drank his full share, and the breeze seemed cool now, and Lazy John wiping the foam from his mustache. That puts heart in a man. And the men whetted their scythes, making the whetstones ring gaily on the steel blades, and they went back to work with a will. Father always maintained that a man would do more work in his 12 hours if he had a rest and all the eggnog he could drink morning and afternoon. They all worked in the hayfield as long as there was light enough to see what they were doing, and the chores were done by lantern light. Next morning, the swaths had been dried, and the boys raked them into windrows with big light wooden rakes that Father had made. Then Joe and John went on cutting hay, and Pierre and Louis spread the swaths behind them. But Almanzo worked on the hay rack. Father drove up from the barns, and Father and Royal pitched the windrows into it. While Almanzo trampled them down. Back and forth he ran on the sweet-smelling hay, packing it down as fast as Royal and Father pitched it into the rack. When the rack would hold no more, he was high up in the air on top of the load. There he lay on his stomach and kicked up his heels, while Father drove down to the big barn. The load of hay barely squeezed under the top of the tall doorway, and it was a long slide to the ground. Father and Royal pitched hay into the haymow, while Almanzo took the water jug to the well. He pumped and then jumped and caught the gushing cold water with his hand and drank. He carried the water to Father and Royal, and he filled the jug again, and then he rode back to the empty hayrack and trampled down another load. Almanzo liked haying time from dawn till dark, long after dark. Every day he was busy, always doing different things. It was like play, and morning and afternoon. There was a cold eggnog, but after 3 weeks of making hay, all the haymows were crammed full and bursting to the meadows were bare. The rush of the harvest time came. The oats were ripe, standing thick and tall and yellow. The wheat was golden, darker than the oats, and the beans were ripe, and the pumpkins and carrots and turnips and potatoes were ready to gather. There was no rest and no play for anyone now. They all worked from candlelight to candlelight. Mother and the girls were making cucumber pickles, green tomato pickles, watermelon rind pickles, and they were drying corn and apples and making preserves. Everything must be saved, nothing wasted of all the summer's bounty. Even the apple cores were saved for making vinegar, and a bundle of oat straw was soaking in a tub in the back porch. Whenever Mother had 1 minute to spare, she braided an inch or two of the oat straw braid for making next summer's hats. The oats were not cut with scythes, but with cradles. Cradles had blades like scythes, but they also had long wooden teeth that caught the cut stalks and held them. When they had cut enough for a bundle, John and Joe slid the stalks off the neat piles. Father and Royal and Almanzo followed behind them, binding them into sheaves. Almanzo had never bound oats before. Father showed him how to knot 2 handfuls of stalks into a long band, and then how to gather up an armful of grain and pull the band tightly around the middle, twist its ends together, and tuck them in tightly. In a little while, he could bind a sheaf pretty well, but not very fast. Father and Royal could bind oats as fast as the reapers cut them. Just before the sun set, the reapers stopped reaping, and they all began shocking the sheaves. All the cut oats must be shocked before dark, because they would spoil if they lay on the ground in the dew overnight. Almanzo could shock oats as well as anybody. He stood 10 sheaves up on their stem ends, close together, with all the heads of grain upward. Then he set 2 more sheaves on top and spread out their stems to make a roof over the 10 sheaves. The shocks looked like little Indian wigwams, dotted all over the field of pale stubble. The wheat field was waiting. There was no time to lose. As soon as all the oats were in the shock, everyone hurried to cut and bind and shock the wheat. It was harder to handle because it was heavier than oats, but Almanzo manfully did his best. And then there was the field of oats and Canada peas. The pea vines were tangled all through the oats, so they could not be shocked. Almanzo raked them into long windrows. Already it was high time to pull the navy beans. Alice had to help with them. Father hauled the bean stakes to the field and set them up, driving them into the ground with a maul. Then Father and Royal hauled the shocked grain into the barns, while Almanzo and Alice pulled the beans. First they laid the rocks all around the bean stakes to keep the beans off the ground. Then they pulled up the beans. With both hands they pulled till their hands could hold no more. They carried the beans to the stakes and laid the roots against them, spreading the long vines out on the rocks. Layer after layer of beans they piled around each stake. The roots were bigger than the vines, so the pile grew higher and higher in the middle, and the tangled vines, full of rattling bean pods, hung down all around. When the roots were piled to the tops of the stakes, Almanzo and Alice laid vines over the top, making a little roof to shed the rain. And then the bean stake was done, and they began another one. The stakes were as tall as Almanzo, and the vines stood out all around them, like Alice's hoop skirts. One day, when Almanzo and Alice came to dinner, the butter buyer was there, and he came every year from New York City. He wore fine city clothes and a gold watch and a chain, and he drove a good team. Everybody liked the butter buyer, and dinner time was exciting when he was there. He brought all the news of politics and fashions and prices in New York City. After dinner, Almanzo went back to work. Alice stayed to watch Mother sell the butter. The butter buyer went down cellar, where the butter tub stood, covered with clean white cloths. Mother took off the cloths, and the butter buyer pushed in his long steel butter tester down through the butter to the bottom of the tub. The butter tester was hollow, I think kind of like a straw, with a slit. There we go. On one side, and when he pulled it out, there in the slit was a sample of butter. Mother did not do any bargaining at all. She said proudly, "My butter speaks for itself." Not one sample from all her tubs had a streak in it. From top to bottom, every tub, Mother's butter was all the same golden, firm, sweet butter. Almanzo saw the butter buyer drive away, and Alice came skipping into the bean field, swinging her sunbonnet by its springs. She called out, "Guess what he did?" "What?" Almanzo said. "He said Mother's butter is the best butter he ever saw anywhere, and he paid her." Guess what he paid? 50 cents a pound. Almanzo was amazed. He had never heard of such a price for butter. "She had 500 pounds, Alice said. "That's $250. He paid her all that money, and she's hitching up right now to take it to the bank." In a little while, Mother drove away in her second best bonnet and her black bombazine. She was going to town in the afternoon on a weekday in harvest time. She had never done such a thing before, but Father was busy in the fields, and she would not keep all that money in the house overnight. Almanzo was proud. His mother was probably the best butter maker in the whole of New York State. People in New York City would eat it and say to one another how good it was, and wonder who made it.